In the winter of 1807, as Napoleon's army swept through Portugal, the royal court fled across the Atlantic to Brazil. For the Portuguese monarchy, it was a humiliating retreat, but for one ambitious princess, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Branded a monster by her critics, ridiculed for her appearance, and feared for her relentless ambition, Carlota Joaquina earned a reputation as one of the most infamous and hated queens in European history. Carlota Joaquina of Spain was born on the 25th of April 1775 and was the eldest surviving child of the future King of Spain, Charles IV, who ascended to the throne there in 1788. An earlier son, Charles, had died before Carlota was born. Although her mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, was still quite young when Carlota was born, the years that followed brought a series of family tragedies. While she gave birth to several healthy daughters, each of her subsequent sons died in infancy. This created concerns about the succession and meant that Carlota was in line to the throne for a large part of her childhood. Finally, a healthy son named Ferdinand arrived in 1784 when Carlota was 9 years old. Perhaps it was the awareness of her position in the line of succession in her earliest years which awoke in Carlota a craving for power, which shaped her later life, as we shall soon see. Growing up, Carlota received a strict education from her Roman Catholic tutors, focusing on what were considered subjects for a female royal. These included a mix of history, geography and languages, along with pursuits like painting, sewing and writing. This made her exceptionally well educated and intelligent, though it did little to suppress the mischievous and playful personality for which she was often remembered. Behind the walls of the royal palace, however, family life was far from stable. Carlota's mother was a domineering figure at the royal court, and there were even rumours of an affair with the head of the Spanish government, Manuel Godoy. This made her a vilified figure in Spanish society, and some of Carlota's poor reputation later on was, to a degree, the product of being painted with the same brush as her mother. On top of this dysfunctional court, Spain had also declined rapidly as a power since the middle of the 17th century, but it still clung on to a vast colonial empire in the Americas, stretching from California and Cuba south to Chile and Argentina. Thus, even after Ferdinand was born in 1784, Carlota retained an important position as the eldest daughter of the future King of Spain. This made her one of the most valuable royal brides in Europe, and in 1785, at just 10 years old, she was married off, a shockingly young age even by the standards of the 18th century. But this was only the beginning of a marriage that would descend into scandal, hatred, and political intrigue. From the late 1770s, negotiations were already underway between the Spanish and Portuguese governments for Carlota to marry Dom John, the second in line to the throne of Portugal. John's parents, who were uncle and niece, had ascended as dual monarchs of Portugal, King Peter III and Queen Maria I in 1777. While Peter would die in 1786, Maria lived down to 1816, so Carlota's life would be substantially shaped by her relationship with her mother-in-law, the first Queen of Portugal in her own right. An agreement whereby Carlota would marry Dom John was concluded in 1785, and a proxy marriage took place in May that year, weeks after her 10th birthday. John, meanwhile, was 18 years old. Because of Carlota's young age, it was agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until 1790, when she was considered old enough to conceive and bear children. Yet only days after the proxy wedding, the 10-year-old princess was sent to Lisbon with a Spanish entourage, leaving her family behind years before the marriage would truly begin. She was consequently at the Portuguese court when the politics of the realm changed in 1788. On the 11th of September that year, her brother-in-law, the heir to the throne, Dom José, died from smallpox, leaving Carlota's husband as the new heir. Moreover, Queen Maria suffered from depression for much of her later life and was even declared insane in 1792. This meant that John was expected to step in as regent and the de facto monarch as early as the 1790s, making Carlota a kind of unofficial queen consort from a young age. In recognition of their elevated status, John and Carlota bore the titles of Prince and Princess of Brazil. In the 1790s and 1800s, as Carlota became an increasingly prominent figure at the Portuguese court, she became an object of ridicule and hatred in both court circles and wider Portuguese society. She was viewed as a woman who was grasping for power and who did not understand the conservative court culture around her. Raised in the far more lavish Spanish court, she struggled to adapt to Portugal's deeply religious and austere royal culture. Her outspoken personality, political involvement, and unconventional public behaviour for royal women fueled gossip and malicious rumours, which were only intensified by widespread anti-Spanish xenophobia. While she was heavily criticised for her behaviour, she was attacked even more viciously for her appearance. During her stay in Lisbon, the French writer Laure Junot, Duchess of Abrantes, left one of the most scathing descriptions of Carlota, writing, "Her ugliness, her dirty and dishevelled hair, her very thin and purplish lips adorned with a thick moustache, her teeth uneven like Pan's flute. I couldn't convince myself that she was a woman, and yet I knew of the facts at that time that amply proved the contrary." The Duchess's husband, Jean Andoche Junot, echoed these sentiments after arriving at the Portuguese court, reportedly exclaiming, "My God, how ugly he is! My God, how ugly the princess is! How ugly they all are!" And it wasn't just French observers who made these scathing remarks. Contemporary accounts frequently described Carlota as short, with a face marked by smallpox scars, a prominent aquiline nose, and the distinctive Bourbon underbite, while some also remarked on her slightly stooped posture. In many ways, she was the antithesis of 18th century courtly beauty ideals. One particularly cruel later account even claimed that she had, quote, "the most bizarrely monstrous head that could ever walk the earth." Her public image was only one source of misery. Behind the scenes, Carlota's marriage would be also unhappy. They had their first child together in 1793, a daughter named Maria Theresa. 8 more children would follow over the next 13 years, only one of whom, Francisco Antonio, died young. Despite the growing strains in her marriage, Carlota was known to be attentive to the health and welfare of her children. However, even her role as mother was surrounded by scandal, as persistent court rumours claimed that not all of her children were fathered by John, with particular suspicion falling on her son Miguel. These claims were never proven, but they added to the atmosphere of gossip and hostility that followed her throughout her life. Still, the marriage was troubled by John's lack of affection, and even more so by his increasingly erratic behaviour. Living in an age when the ideas of Enlightenment and the French Revolution were spreading across Europe, he developed an obsessive fear that the revolution would reach Portugal. Court rumours even claimed that he wandered the halls of the royal palace at night in a semi-delirious state. By the early 1800s, the royal marriage had descended into open political warfare. In 1805, by which time Carlota was 30, she conspired to seize power from her husband, the Prince Regent, planning to have him arrested and declared unfit for rule, just as his mother had been. Yet the plot was uncovered, and her co-conspirators were arrested. Carlota escaped imprisonment only because John refused to expose the scandal publicly. Instead, he banished her to the palaces of Queluz and Ramalhão, while he withdrew to Mafra, effectively ending their marriage. It was during this exile that she earned the infamous nickname, the Shrew of Queluz. Carlota's life in Portugal, especially from around 1806 onwards, was shaped by wider political developments in Western Europe. A few years after she married John, the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Initially, it was a moderate revolution that aimed to establish a constitutional monarchy. Gradually, it became more radical, and eventually it developed into a counter-revolution and a pan-European war in 1792. This gradually pulled in almost every power in Europe. Portugal was one of the outliers. For centuries, the kingdom had largely tried to avoid becoming entangled in Europe's endless religious and dynastic wars. On the other hand, it had a loose alliance with England that stretched all the way back to the early 1660s, when Catherine of Braganza had married King Charles II of England. This meant that Portugal did join the War of the First Coalition against the French in 1793, but it never played a major role in the intermittent French Revolutionary Wars that followed down to the end of the 18th century. What changed matters for Portugal and for Carlota was the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and his conquest of a vast part of continental Europe between the mid-1790s and the mid-1800s. In 1807, fresh off of conquering Germany and Poland, Napoleon turned back west and invaded Portugal with the goal of incorporating the Iberian royal family into his empire. He would, for instance, make one of his brothers, Joseph, the King of Spain in 1808. Before that ever happened, Portugal had been conquered, and Carlota, along with the rest of the royal court and government, had fled over the Atlantic Ocean to establish a government in exile in Brazil, Portugal's vast South American colony. After a dreadful voyage in the winter of 1807, during which Carlota was forced to shave her head because of a lice infestation aboard the ship, the Portuguese court in exile finally arrived in Rio de Janeiro. She would spend the next 13 years in Brazil, but her years there would prove to be among the most turbulent and politically ambitious of her life. It was in South America that Carlota's ambitions to rule really became clear. While her mother-in-law remained as the nominal ruler of Portugal and its colonial empire, events elsewhere in South America presented an opportunity for Carlota to extend her influence. Wars of independence broke out all across the Spanish colonies in the late 1800s after France took over Spain itself in Europe. One faction in the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata even proposed making Carlota its regent, a movement that became known as Carlotism. This made sense when we consider that Carlota was a daughter of King Charles IV of Spain. The scheme won the support of the British Admiral Sir Sidney Smith, but it faced opposition from her own husband, the Portuguese government in exile, Spanish officials, and many local elites. Carlota also undermined her own chances by insisting on exercising the powers of an absolute monarch, while many of her supporters envisioned her as a constitutional figurehead. The movement gradually collapsed, and after the Latin American Wars of Independence, the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata eventually evolved into the Republic of Argentina. Carlota's time in Brazil was controversial in other ways too. She was disdainful of the people, drank a lot, and allegedly took to drinking marijuana tea, as well as becoming the subject of persistent rumours of an affair with a prominent Brazilian businessman. Yet amid the scandal came the moment she had long awaited. On the 20th of March 1816, Queen Marie I died at the age of 81. At 40 years old, Carlota finally achieved the title she had waited decades for, becoming Queen Consort of Portugal. But after finally gaining the crown, her greatest political battles were still to come. By the time they became king and queen, Portugal had long been liberated, after the Portuguese and Spanish, with significant British aid, pushed the French out of the Iberian Peninsula in 1813 and 1814, as Napoleon's empire collapsed in the wake of his ill-judged invasion of Russia in 1812. Nonetheless, the Portuguese royal court did not immediately relocate back to Lisbon, even after Napoleon's final downfall in the summer of 1815. The delay was owing to the profound uncertainties about what kind of kingdom would be re-established after the Napoleonic Wars. That uncertainty finally came to a head with the Liberal Revolution of 1820, when a military uprising demanded the establishment of a constitutional monarchy and forced the royal family to return to Portugal. On the 26th of April 1821, they departed Brazil. According to the Viscount of Porto Seguro, the emotions of the king and the royal family upon leaving Brazil were revealed in the tears of everyone, except the queen. Carlota, who had never enjoyed life in Brazil, was reportedly delighted to leave. One famous story even claims that, before boarding the ship, she shook the dust from her shoes, declaring, "I shall not take even the dust of this land." After returning to Portugal, John accepted the country's first constitution in 1822. It sought to end absolutism in Portugal, yet it was only minimally successful, and it was quickly abandoned in 1823. At the same time, Brazil split away to become the independent Empire of Brazil under Carlota's son Pedro in 1822, removing a colony which Portugal had relied on for its wealth throughout the 18th century. The Liberal Revolution was indicative of the complex political situation that Carlota, her husband and the rest of the royal establishment were returning to after the Napoleonic Wars ended. A power struggle ensued as Carlotta allied with her younger son Miguel to try and claim power from her husband. John briefly became a prisoner in Albert name, but a British intervention in 1824 led to Miguel being exiled and John and his supporters retaking control of the government. He then ruled until his death in March 1826, aged 58. It was a miracle that Carlotta's marriage had lasted down to the death of one of the parties, despite the acrimony, and she refused to visit him in his final illness. John's passing plunged Portugal into a complex succession crisis. Miguel, the expected heir, was still in exile, while, as mentioned, his elder brother Pedro was ruling the newly independent Empire of Brazil. Pedro briefly claimed the Portuguese throne before abdicating in favour of his young daughter, who became Queen Maria II in May 1826. Miguel later returned in 1828 to reclaim the crown, with a plan to avert civil war by marrying his niece Queen Maria, though this never materialised. By the time this rapid turnover of rulers occurred between 1826 and 1828, Carlotta had been marginalised in Portuguese politics. Despite Miguel's earlier alliance with his mother, he did not recall her to court after he became king in 1828. Instead, she spent her later years embittered and estranged from court life, living instead in the countryside outside Lisbon at the Palace of Queluz. She died on the 7th of January 1830 at 54 years of age. By then, a fresh civil war was underway that would eventually end 4 years later with Miguel being deposed. He lived out the remaining 32 years of his life in exile, with Queen Maria II reclaiming the throne in 1834. Carlotta was initially buried in Sintra, before being reinterred in 1854 beside her estranged husband in the royal pantheon of the Braganza dynasty in Lisbon. Although she had always aspired to greater power, Carlota Joaquina nevertheless spent nearly her entire adult life at the heart of one of the world's largest monarchies, serving as queen or princess regent over Portugal and its vast empire stretching across Brazil, Africa and Asia. To her enemies, she was an ugly, scheming, power-hungry foreign queen. To others, she was an intelligent and determined woman who refused to accept the limits placed on royal women of her age. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. In any case, she remains one of the most fascinating and controversial queens in Iberian history. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Carlota Joaquina of Spain. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you want more royalty or more Spanish or Portuguese royalty, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed so you can see all my videos as soon as I upload. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to see all of my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.